It's an epidemic. How many writers sit down to write their first book full of inspiration and excitement, only to have things fall apart so quickly? Or even worse, they spend so much time planning that they never start writing. And there's 1,000 different reasons that this might happen. Today, we're going to talk about different ways to plan your novel, ranging from things you have heard before, like Save the Cat or The Hero's Journey, to things you might never have considered, like the screenplay approach. Wow. If you're stuck at the beginning of your book, or you're looking for ways to improve your own process, then this is the episode for you. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to the business of writing, you can join me every Monday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your own writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the podcast. I'm super excited to dive into this episode with you today because there is a very clear moment that inspired our first point today. And the more that I think about it, the more it makes sense to me. And so I just need to get it out for you. By the way, the YouTube channel just released a killer video on writing routines. I spent a week waking up at 5 a.m. to write because I felt like I wasn't giving writing the focus that it needs. You know, that kind of thing happens when you have like the new year and you're like, I'm going to start exercising now, but also I'm really going to focus on like doing this and this and this. The hobbies like writing kind of fall to the wayside, but not today, or this past week. Check out the channel for what went right and what went wrong. And this Friday, look forward to a dope video about the qualities that all great characters have in common. On to the podcast. So let me set the scene first, right? We're talking about different ways to plan your novel. And we're going to talk about a few things like, plot frameworks, different ideas for how to approach writing, and even my own process. And that hopefully, you can find some tips and tricks to help you. So let me tell you what happened, right? The whole inspiration behind this thing. The other day, I was out walking with the dogs in snowy Wisconsin, listening to a podcast. And this podcast is a read-along podcast for the enormous and daunting Malazan Book of the Fallen, a 10-book epic fantasy that's dark and gritty and grim and not at all afraid to leave the reader with questions. So the 10 Very Big Books podcast is a fantastic resource for anyone who's reading these books because you have so many questions. It's one person who has read the books alongside 3 other people who are reading the books for the first time and discussing it chapter by chapter. But the best part is that the author, Steven Erikson, joins them after they complete each book. So in this episode I was listening to, Steven Erikson was talking about sort of the history of writing these books, and he said something super interesting to me. He said that the first book of this series, called Gardens of the Moon, wasn't originally written as a book. Instead, he wrote Gardens of the Moon as a screenplay. Now, Erikson mentions that he did this because it's easier to write a screenplay than it is to write a book. But something in my brain kind of clicked. I don't know. I never considered this idea at all. And before we get into it, I'm not saying to stop writing your book and start writing a screenplay. That's not the direction we're taking this. Instead, what's been bouncing around in my brain like a DVD logo on that, on that screensaver screen is that I think screenplay writing a screenplay can be part of your planning process in like a major way. All right, bear with me. Let me cook, okay? Hear me out. So I'm inspired to try this. And, the next time I'm beginning a project, I'm going to plan my story like normal. And we'll talk about my process in detail later in this episode. But before I start writing, I'm going to note a handful of key scenes and write them out as screenplays. Now, why is this so, exciting to me? Why is this so interesting to me? I think the number one reason is when I'm writing, when I'm like, knee deep in it, right? I'm in there with the characters. When I'm writing my stories, it's almost like I am in my head watching a movie. And I'm just kind of trying to describe what I'm seeing the best way that I can. Let me know if you're the same way or not. I know there's a lot of different ways that people can sort of experience story like that in their head. Some people, it's like watching a movie. Sometimes to other people, you are one of the characters seeing through their eyes. Some people see in black and white when they're in their imagination like that. Some people see in color. I don't know. There's a very wide range of how people experience their own story like that. But for me, a screenplay is pretty close to what I'm experiencing in my head. And one of the biggest reasons why I think this could be useful to planning out your story is because a screenplay is almost like a shortcut to figuring out your characters, especially when you're using it in the planning stage. So think about this. A screenplay, if you were to write a screenplay, is less about the setting and the description, and it's more about the actions and the dialogue of the characters. And look, any way that you can start to affirm who the characters in your story might be can also help you figure out other details. Now, this isn't that crazy. Now, but the idea of like doing this as a screenplay is a little bit more crazy. But like back in episode 1 of the podcast, we talked about writing routines. This isn't much different than N.K. Jemison's writing routine tips that we covered, right? They talked about exploratory writing. They talked about writing the first chapter a couple different times with different POV characters and vibes or different locations until you sort of find something that feels right. The screenplay approach is a little similar to this idea of exploratory writing, but with more of a focus on action and on the characters. And if you wanted to go even further, you could extrapolate this into, doing a screenplay for the most important scenes of every major sequence of the novel. And now if you were to do this, you would now know all of those most important, almost like emotional story beats of your story. That sounds redundant. And how your characters would handle them. And this is almost like something we're going to talk about a little later in this podcast, which is called like the headlight writing method. If you've never heard about that, stick around. So now I think the normal question that would follow up all of this discussion is like, okay, well, at this point, should I just write a screenplay? No, of course not. You're still planning your story. It's just this is part of that planning process. And, if you were to write a screenplay, there's a lot more you have to focus on, like trying to connect your scenes, trying to transition them well, like how are you going to get from point A to point B? And that's, the difficulty of a final completed project. You're not really making a final product with your screenplay, but you are figuring out information about how your characters will act and interact and exist within the plot and the world of this story. I think another sort of question that comes up anytime we're thinking about, different processes and improving our processes is, why take the risk? You know what I mean? Like, if writing and finishing a draft is so hard, right? It's tens and dozens of hours of your time and discipline and focus. Wouldn't you have the best chance of finishing and publishing your book if you just use the methods that maybe work? Either that's because you've gone through the process of writing a book before and it's worked and now you're going to do it all over again. Or if it's something where you're just like, I am not open to all this crazy exploratory stuff. I'm just going to follow what Stephen King does, because he's got it all figured out. If you're a newer writer, maybe that is a good place to start. But here's the thing. I recommend that you always try to twist your process up a little bit with every project, because the process that you know right now is a result of what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past. If you continue to experiment, you'll continue to refine, because you're going to learn more about what works and what doesn't work. Now, this step of, this idea of, writing these screenplay scenes. It could be something that you give yourself a week to play around with, right? Just like slowly refining how your characters interact with each other in these big moments. You find out how to best present the action and the reaction, and you can kind of use the information you get from this almost as a template. Now, I've kind of played around with a concept like this before. There's, when I talk about the proto draft, which I have a fantastic YouTube video on the proto draft, it is the secret to finishing your first manuscript. I swear by it. And one of those things I talk about with the proto draft is this idea of something called non-linear writing. And in that video, non-linear writing is more of a concept of, what your story is supposed to be. So if you're writing your proto draft and you get to a scene where you just can't quite get it right, or you don't know how to continue, nonlinear writing is the idea that, where the story's going to go, jot some notes down about this scene that you don't know how to tackle, and just skip to the next one and keep moving. Whatever you do, keep moving. Now, nonlinear writing is also something I talked about with how I approach writing, which is like a very cinematic style. When I'm planning a novel, one of the things I typically do is I try to think of what are the moments in the story that if it was a movie, if you were, going to see this in theaters, as you're leaving the theater, you're still talking about that moment of betrayal that led our main character to feeling totally lost, or that big moment of action that was just awe-inspiring and jaw-dropping, or that moment of romance that was so satisfying, it felt so earned that you thought that made the entire movie. And the more cinematic moments I can think of for a project, the more confident I feel like it's going to make a good story, that I have something here. And one of the things I've talked about doing is writing some of those cinematic moments before I've written the rest of the draft, simply to kind of figure out some of those details of the story, to submit how I kind of would want it to play out, and also to form a checkpoint in the story to say that, okay, this is something that's definitely going to happen. I feel really good about it. It should happen at this part of the story, no matter how else I write the rest of the draft, whether it's really structured with plot or whether I'm more discovering what's going to happen. I have this landmark, this checkpoint, this moment that says these characters need to be here at this time. And that's sort of a way to help structure yourself to make sure you're hitting those important parts. And that's very similar to what we're talking about now. Yes, that was my transition. It wasn't a great transition, but that was my transition. Let's talk about plotting, pantsing, and the glorious in-between of the headlight method. If you haven't heard of the headlight method, it might be the key that you're missing to really making great progress on writing your stories, especially if you've been struggling between figuring out, am I someone who wants to plan every single detail? Am I someone who wants to fly by the seat of my pants and just discover everything as I'm writing? Of course, this huge debate, I shouldn't say debate, it's not really an argument. The huge conversation that all writers kind of chime into is the idea of, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? And of course, this is not a black and white thing. It's not a binary. It's a gradient, right? We all know that, but it's worth saying just in case, right? And you exist somewhere on that gradient. Like for me, I always plan out my story past the inciting incident, at least to Act 2. And then I have specific moments I want to happen across Act 2. Typically, these are the big moments that need to happen as I'm building up towards the climax of the story. And then I have the ending all planned out. However, I hardly plan out my characters at all. It's actually hilarious the amount of planning I don't do regarding characters. I might have a photo of kind of how I picture this character. And then I might have one line of who they are. This is their role in the story. This is their profession. This is, a key detail, and everything else about my characters, which I love discovering my characters, comes out just through writing them and kind of figuring out how they're supposed to fit in the plot of the story. I like to know where the story is going and to have all of my pieces on the chessboard, and then I like to steer my characters in the right direction, but still uncover who they are within the story. Now, the headlight method is something I heard about first when I was speaking to indie author Rob J. Hayes. And if you haven't read any of Rob J. Hayes' books, they are a lot of fun. They have the series Titan Hoppers, Mortal Techniques, and a hugely successful Kickstarter that they ran for a series that's coming out now called the God Eater Saga. And Rob J. Hayes told me about his process, the headlight method, and it's, like I said, it's an existing thing, but I first heard about it from Rob. So this is, in my opinion, the perfect space between plotting and pantsing. Anne Lamott, who is the author of the fantastic writing book Bird by Bird, one of the favorites of this channel, expands on this and has a quote, quoting someone else. You'll see what I mean. She says, E.L. Doctorow said once that writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You can see only as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And Lamott continues to say, you don't have to see where you're going. You don't have to see your destination or everything you will pass along the way. You just have to see 2 or 3 feet ahead of you. This is right up there with the best advice on writing or life that I have ever heard. So that's what Anne Lamott says. Now, Rob J. Hayes, when I was talking with him, phrased it like this. He phrased it like his writing style is he's driving with his headlights. He's discovering the way, but he knows what signs and landmarks that he needs to pass to get to his destination. And this allows him the benefits of discovery writing and being able to sort of follow the natural storylines that come out as you write. But it also gives you the benefit of knowing all the things you need to complete before you get to that big climactic ending. So I recommend that you experiment, right? Whether it's with your next novel or short story or the writing challenges that we might do over on the Discord server or whatever. If you find that you lose motivation or inspiration or momentum, maybe it's because you're writing the wrong way. And here's what I mean by that. I've found that things like imposter syndrome which is kind of like what we would say, meaning, right, you've lost motivation or inspiration and momentum. That imposter syndrome comes up most frequently, not when you're having a great time writing, but usually when you don't know what to do next, or you're writing a scene that really has no purpose, or you don't know how to get out of this strange moment in your plot that you've somehow built. That's when imposter syndrome strikes the hardest. And sometimes that can be enough to derail your entire project and make you never finish your story, right? Raise your hand if that's happened to you before, and every single listener here should be raising their hand. So it may be that you think you're a plotter, a planner. It may be that you think you're someone who just does discovery writing like all the great authors do, like Anne Lamott and Stephen King, that rarely plot out much of anything. But the reality is, maybe you're not. Maybe you think you are. Maybe you need to shift yourself on that gradient of plotting and pantsing and find what that in-between method is best for you. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but I'll go ahead and tell you, for me, I am varying levels of plotting and pantsing based on what story I'm writing, based on the amount of just initial understanding of my story that I might have before I start writing, and also different aspects of my story get different levels of planning, right? I've told you that I plan out my plot, but I very rarely plan out my characters. And that's because I feel comfortable writing a character that feels, realistic and fun to read. But I know that if I don't have my plot planned out, then my story, especially my proto draft, is going to end up being a little meandering. And that's from past projects that I've done that haven't reached that end state. back in episode 1, we talked about how there's no such thing as a failed project, because every single time that you sit down and you start a project and you write a story, whether or not you finish it, whether or not you even begin it, and definitely whether or not you end up publishing it, you figure out a little bit more about what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And that's the importance of experimenting. So look, let's talk about tools for writing, because this is another place where maybe you are planning your novel incorrectly because you're using the wrong tools. If all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, and you can't. There's just some things you can't do with a hammer. Hot take. Hot take. Some things you can't do with a hammer. You heard it here first. So here's the deal. There's tons of writing software. I use Scrivener, which is pretty much like a big folder system with a bunch of features for organization and planning. And I mean, like, even in Scrivener, first off, a lot of these things kind of feel like hidden features. Did you know you can like organize your entire plots according to timelines and sequential events, or completely free-form organizations with note cards, right? That's not something anyone tells you about Scrivener. You just kind of have to accidentally find it on your own. But then there's other software, right? There's Plotter, which is a piece of software specifically designed to help you plot your novel out. And it just gives you a huge suite of tools to try that out, right? To like use their tools to plan your story out better. There's Campfire, which is a modular web-based writing software. There's so many different tools. And I bring all of this up mostly because I'm starting to come around to the idea that as useful as writing tools are, I don't know if they are the best for planning things. Right now, I'm mulling over the idea that planning needs to happen in 2 stages. And I'm going to explain why I think that. I'm going to name the stages, and you tell me if you're on board with this or if I'm crazy. So consider this, the 2 stages of planning: free form and structured. And this idea is born off of some of the best planning I've ever done, which is just me in front of a blank whiteboard with a handful of markers. There's no outline that I have to type in. There's, I'm not using bullet points because Microsoft Word makes bullet points so easy. I'm just picking a spot on the whiteboard and writing. And there's something, at least to me, something inspiring about standing on a whiteboard that I don't get when I'm just looking at a new Scrivener project. There's this element of like, okay, it's super easy to add stuff. It's super easy to erase what I've done. And it's going to be super easy for me to take this off of the whiteboard somewhere else if I really, really like it. And all of those barriers being lowered mean that like I have no inhibitions about trying to plan out a character, and if I don't like them, just totally removing them, and that's okay. And the whiteboard feels like an appropriate place to do that. In our Writing Routines podcast, right, we looked at how Neil Gaiman uses a notebook and his favorite fountain pens to plan out a story. He writes out plot beats, specific dialogue, character sketches. He's scratching things out, and later on, he turns it into a more structured approach to the story. And this is what I think could be the 2 steps of planning. Step 1, total freeform. Let your mind wander. Make a mind map. Make a flowchart if you wanted to. Do character sketches. Just go crazy. And then step 2 of planning is taking what you've got on that whiteboard, turning it into something more structured in your writing tool of choice, and then continuing that planning process using that as the foundation. One of them, definitely, at least to me, seems more sort of flush with creativity than the other one. My current process when I'm planning out a story is not doing that. But it's something that I'm hoping in my next project I can approach. And I'll let you know exactly how that goes. In case you're wondering, the project I'm working on right now is called Upon Careless Gray Hills. It is a thriller set in a small, real place in Alaska called Whittier, Alaska, where all 200 residents in this small town, only accessible by a tunnel through a mountain, They all live in one apartment complex. So what happens when a killer's on the loose? And that tunnel, that tunnel is getting closed down. All right, let's talk about my current process, right? When I'm sort of approaching a story. When I plan a story, a lot of it actually happens pretty far away from my laptop, right? I'm not immediately jotting down all of my ideas. I do what's called passive planning, right? This is like the idea where I've had some moment of inspiration. I have this nugget of an idea, and it feels like it has some potential. But before I write a single thing down, I just wait and I think about it. I know, pretty crazy. I'm over here thinking with the best of them. If that idea doesn't stick around, then it probably wasn't worth dedicating months of my life to writing a draft for that story. But if it does stick around, then I continue to mull over that idea, the world, the plot, and the characters. And to me, this is kind of like pre-production to a movie. I'm just like slowly refining different ideas within this story. And at some point, I might pick up my laptop after a night where I've done lots of other kinds of work. And I consider this not to be like my job at this point, right? Usually my job is going to be making the podcast episodes, making the YouTube channel, working with our Discord community, making all that kind of stuff. And then probably also writing some other story that I'm like in the weeds in. But I allow myself to treat planning other stories as kind of like a hobby, something to do after work. So one night I'll pick up my laptop and I've been mulling over this idea and I'll start a new Scrivener project and I begin to actually put some details down. And this might include something like casting my characters, either with actors that I know that I kind of like, I like the look of them for this character. It might be from some model database I look up. It might be other various celebrities, or it may even be just an AI image where I can type in a very specific kind of description. And all of these things are just to help me visualize this story. It kind of helps me get into the story a little bit more. And after that, I might begin creating locations for the story. And again, at this point, it's all fun. It's all games. It's just this world starting to come into view like a Polaroid picture. I think one of the big, almost like misconceptions that especially newer writers might have, people who haven't finished their, turned a manuscript into a final draft yet, I think one of the big misconceptions might go into how you plan your story. I think some people think, okay, I need to sit down and figure out the world that this story is going to take place in. And this world building is definitely one of the premier places where this misconception happens. I'm going to sit down and plan out this cool world for my cool characters and my cool plot. And then after I do that, I'm going to sit down and create some cool characters. And after I do that, I'm going to now make my cool plot. And everything will be ready to go. But in reality, everything should be planned concurrently. What do I mean by that? I mean that you shouldn't approach planning a story like I'm going to plan everything about my characters and then my plot and then my setting, or the case where you have almost like an assignment that you need to complete before you move on to the next step. What you need to be doing when you're planning your novel is making a decision about one element of your story and having that influence the other elements of your story. Every decision happens together and influences other aspects of your story. You make a decision about the plot, well, your characters need to fit within this new decision about your plot. Now, either you create a character that would thrive in this situation or a character that would be particularly challenged within this situation, and then you do the same thing for the setting. And whatever you decide about your setting needs to reflect back on those characters. And so everything needs to slowly come into focus at the same time. And the reason for this is that at the end of this planning, you want to have something cohesive, something that was all designed together. It's not, I'm going to plan out my world, and then I'm going to plan out my characters, and then I'm going to plan out my, plot. It's every decision that you make will have some ramifications in the other elements of your story. And that's how you make something feel cohesive. And that's extremely important when we're talking a novel. So keep in mind how each of these elements in your story plays together. Does the plot revolve around solving the identity of a killer? Okay, well then if that's the case, you should create a character maybe who's struggling to find their own identity. And you know what? Maybe we should create a setting that's full of reflections, or create a world that's constantly questions who your character is. Maybe you want to fill it with symbols and ideas that revolve around identity, right? So one decision about the plot had some ramifications on our other two elements. And you just kind of keep working in this positive feedback loop until everything feels right. And then it comes to things like plot frameworks, which I wholeheartedly believe in. I love a good plot framework. In fact, I'm on a journey to find, what are the best plot frameworks I can stick in my back pocket and always have quick and easy access to them, right? Save the Cat is a great plot framework to play around with. Hero's Journey is a classic. Dan Harmon's Story Circle. If your story includes something like identity and introspection, maybe even you could consider the feminist response to the hero's journey and explore the heroine's journey, which spends more time exploring the internal and spiritual change of your character as opposed to their actions to achieve a quest, right? Now, here's the big takeaway to this whole idea of plot frameworks. This is what I want you to leave this episode with if you didn't love the screenplay approach. Here's a big takeaway. I think some newer writers also think that I need to find that perfect plot framework. And once I do, my stories will be so much easier to plan. That's wrong. Incorrect. That's my buzzer sound. Here's the deal. Each story that you write may best fit into a different framework. This isn't a one and done situation. It's more of like a glass slipper experience, right? There is a plot framework that'll best fit your understanding of your story. And each story that you write, you should look at a bunch of different plot frameworks to use as guidance there. And a plot framework is guidance. It's not a rule that you have to follow. It's not, law. It's someone else giving you a series of steps that you can kind of nudge your story in, particularly in regards to things like making sure your pacing's really strong, making sure that your story is always, amping up in intensity and not ever lulling back. And then at some point, you finally got to start writing. And you know what? This is really fun, right? Get ready to explore your world. You get to live in that story. You're going to hit brick walls. You're going to achieve milestones. You're going to celebrate, and you're going to hate your story. It's a wild ride. But the thing is, writing is all about experimentation until you find something that really just clicks with you. And I hope that these methods that we are talking about here get you excited to start writing your next project. I really hope so, because writing is something that you can do for the rest of your life, and that's a great feeling. It's sometimes hard to imagine that where you're at in your writing journey right now is the beginning of your journey. Even if you put out a book or two, if you plan on writing, and I think most people especially who write their first book, plan on writing for the rest of their lives, you have a lot of time to refine, to learn, and to grow. And that's a damn good feeling. So I hope you're encouraged and motivated to write. Catch this week's video where you can learn what qualities all great characters have in common. Come hang out in the Discord with hundreds of other writers and let me hear your thoughts on the podcast. And if you have an idea for a topic you'd like to see covered, let me know. Anyways, hope you have a great week. See you next Monday.